she stood in front of the judge alone, until a cowboy walked in and changed everything. The sun burned over Dust Creek, Texas on July 14th, 1883. Inside the small wooden courtroom, the air was thick and dry, heavy with judgment. Clara Dawson, 26, stood alone before the bench, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. The town watched in silence, eager for a sentence, not the truth. She was accused of stealing gold from a rancher, yet no one cared to hear her side. The wooden floor creaked under her boots as the judge raised his gavel. Judge Harmon, known for his cold heart and iron rules, stared at her as if she was already guilty. Sweat rolled down her temple, mixing with fear and pride. Every heartbeat echoed louder than the murmurs behind her. Somewhere beyond those courtroom walls, the truth waited, hidden in the dust and distance. But in that moment, Clara was truly alone, until the sound of spurs broke the silence. The sound of spurs faded into the heavy silence as every eye in the courtroom turned toward the door. The hinges groaned, and a faint breeze slipped inside, carrying dust and tension with it. Clara's heart thudded once, hard and uncertain, as a tall shadow stretched across the floorboards. She didn't dare turn around. The judge's gavel hung midair, frozen between judgment and mercy. "Who enters my courtroom uncalled?" Judge Harmon's deep voice broke the stillness. The stranger stepped forward slowly, the brim of his hat hiding his face until he stopped beside Clara. Only then did she look up, and her breath caught. It was Eli Carter, the cowboy who vanished months ago, the man the town whispered was dead. The crowd stirred, gasps rolling like wind over wheat fields. Eli lifted his head, calm but fierce, his voice low and certain. "I'm the man she's been waiting for," he said, and his words struck the room like a bullet of truth. The judge narrowed his eyes, measuring every word, but Eli didn't flinch. He looked at Clara, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen since the day he rode away. "Promise. You claim to know this woman?" the judge asked. Eli nodded. "Better than anyone here, sir. She's no thief." "I am." The room erupted in disbelief. Men muttered, women gasped, and someone dropped a hat. Judge Harmon slammed the gavel once, silencing the noise. "You confess to the theft?" Eli's jaw tightened. "No, Your Honor, I confess to the truth." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, edges burned and torn. Clara stared, recognizing it instantly, the letter she wrote and never sent. Eli handed it to the judge, his voice steady though his hands bore the scars of miles ridden hard. "That gold was never hers," he said. "She found it near the river after a gunfight. I was bleeding out nearby. She tried to save me and keep the gold safe till I came back." Clara's throat ached. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. The judge read the letter slowly, lips tightening with every line. The room's stillness deepened until even the dust seemed afraid to move. When he finished, he looked at Eli, then at Clara. "Why didn't you come sooner?" he asked. Eli's eyes softened. "Because I thought leaving her behind was the only way to keep her safe. But I was wrong." Clara's breath shivered. The judge leaned back, gaze shifting between them. The crowd that once condemned her now stood silent, unsure of what to believe. Outside, thunder rolled far away, a sound rare in Dust Creek but fitting for the storm that had just broken. The judge sighed, set the letter down, and for the first time that day, his voice lost its edge. "Maybe," he said quietly, "truth does ride slower than lies, but it gets here all the same." Clara closed her eyes as the gavel finally fell, not as punishment but as peace, and for the first time in months, she felt free. The echo of the gavel still hung in the air when the doors of the courtroom swung open again, slamming against the walls with a force that made every head turn. A cloud of dust rolled in with the dry Texas wind, curling through the sunlight like smoke. Clara's heart skipped as the noise shattered the silence that had settled over the room. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing through the haze, and saw the figure standing there. Broad shoulders, worn boots, and the kind of stillness that only men who had seen too much could carry. Eli Carter stepped into the light, his hat low over his brow, his coat lined with road dust and silence. The townsfolk whispered his name like it was a ghost come walking. For months, people said he'd vanished, maybe shot in the canyons or swallowed by the borderlands. But here he was, breathing, real, and staring straight at Clara. The judge frowned, his gavel lowering as curiosity replaced anger. "State your business, stranger," he said, his tone sharp as iron. Eli walked forward, each step measured, boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped beside Clara without glancing at anyone else. The room seemed to shrink around them, every breath suspended. Slowly, he took off his hat, the sunlight catching the edge of his jaw, and his voice came low, steady, and certain. "I'm the man she's been waiting for." The words fell like a strike of thunder, and the courtroom gasped as one. Clara froze, unsure whether to believe her eyes or her heart. The judge's hand gripped the bench. "And who exactly are you to speak for this woman?" Eli's eyes didn't move from Clara's face. Someone who owes her the truth. He turned to the judge. I was there when it happened. She saved me, and she's paying for what I did. The crowd erupted again, a wave of murmurs and disbelief, the kind that rolls through a place where justice is rarely questioned. The sheriff at the back shifted uneasily, his hand on the holster. Clara wanted to speak, to ask why he'd come back now after all this time, but her throat felt locked. Eli's presence was both a promise and a wound reopened. The judge's gaze hardened. You better have proof, Cowboy, or you'll hang beside her. Eli reached inside his coat, pulling out a weathered notebook bound in leather. Everything you need to know is written here, he said. The judge signaled for the bailiff to bring it forward. As the notebook passed from hand to hand, the crowd leaned closer, the air thick with suspicion and awe. Clara's chest rose and fell as her eyes met Eli's again. For a moment, the world outside vanished. No whispers, no judgment, only the quiet understanding of two lives bound by a secret too heavy to carry alone. The judge began reading, and as each line left his lips, the truth started to breathe inside that room, slow and unstoppable, like dawn creeping over the desert. The judge's eyes moved slowly across the pages of the worn notebook, his expression unreadable, while the restless crowd leaned forward, their curiosity burning hotter than the Texas sun outside. Eli stood still beside Clara, the weight of silence pressing on his shoulders. When the judge finally looked up, his voice came calm but sharp. What exactly are you claiming here, Mr. Carter? Eli took a slow breath, his voice steady but heavy with truth. I'm saying that gold never belonged to her. I found it. I found it the night the ranchers' wagons were ambushed near Red Hollow. There was gunfire, smoke, and chaos. I was shot and fell by the river. She found me there bleeding and the gold chest beside me. She could have left me to die and taken it all, but she didn't. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Clara's heart pounded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table to keep from trembling. The judge squinted, suspicious but curious. If what you say is true, why didn't you speak before now? Eli hesitated, his eyes falling briefly to the floor before meeting Clara's again. Because I was running from the same men who robbed that wagon. I thought if I stayed gone, they'd forget her name. I thought I was protecting her, but all I did was leave her alone to take the fall. He reached into his coat again, pulling out a folded, torn letter, edges darkened from dust and fire. The courtroom watched as he placed it on the judge's bench. That's my handwriting, he said quietly. It's proof she was never part of any crime. I wrote it the night she found me before I blacked out. I told her to take the gold to town and explain everything, but before she could, I was gone. The judge unfolded the fragile paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the faded ink aloud. The words were simple, honest, and raw. Eli's confession, his gratitude, and his warning for whoever found him not to blame the woman who tried to save his life. Clara's breath caught as those words filled the room, turning every stare from accusation to doubt. Eli's voice softened. She carried that letter for weeks trying to prove her innocence, but no one listened. They saw her alone and decided guilt was easier to believe than truth. A heavy silence followed. Even the sheriff's hand fell from his belt. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The judge looked at the letter again, then back at Clara. You risked your name for this man? He asked. She swallowed hard, her voice quiet but clear. I risked more than that, Your Honor. I risked my life. The judge nodded slowly, something changing behind his eyes. For the first time that day, Clara saw a flicker of doubt in him. Proof that truth, though late, had finally found its way inside that room. The judge held the fragile letter in his trembling hands, his eyes moving slowly over each line as the courtroom sank into silence so deep that even the ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed to fade. The words written in Eli's rough handwriting carried more weight than any testimony spoken that day. Clara stood motionless, her breath unsteady, her eyes glistening under the dim light. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears as she watched the judge's face shift from suspicion to something softer, something human. When he finally looked up, the firmness in his gaze had melted into quiet reflection. These words, he said lowly, they speak of sacrifice and truth, not greed. The crowd murmured again, their judgment turning into guilt for the way they had doubted her. Eli stepped closer, his voice low but clear. I left to keep her safe, he said, his tone carrying both regret and relief. Those men who robbed the wagons, they were hunting me. I thought if I disappeared, they'd never look her way. But I was wrong. I heard she'd been taken and I couldn't run any longer. The judge's expression softened further, the hardness in his jaw fading as he looked between them. You came back knowing it could cost you your life, he said. Eli nodded. Some debts can't be paid with gold, Your Honor, only with truth. Clara's eyes filled until tears finally escaped, tracing down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but no words came. For the first time, the people in that room saw her not as a thief, but as a woman who had carried the weight of another's sins without complaint. The tension that had filled the courtroom began to break like a storm clearing after a long drought. The same townsfolk who once whispered behind her back now looked down, ashamed of their silence. Even the sheriff, who once swore she was guilty, shifted uneasily, his gaze falling to the floor. The judge folded the letter with care, setting it gently on the bench as if afraid it might crumble. "The truth has a way of arriving late," he said quietly, "but it arrives all the same." Clara finally found her voice, shaky but strong. "I never wanted anyone to suffer for me," she whispered. Eli turned toward her, his eyes soft but full of ache. "You already did," he replied, "and I couldn't let it stay that way." The quiet between them was filled with everything they couldn't say. Months of fear, loyalty, and the fragile thread of trust that somehow hadn't broken. The judge leaned back, his gavel resting still in his hand. His tone no longer the voice of the law, but of an old man who had seen too many lives ruined by pride. "Maybe mercy isn't weakness," he murmured. "Maybe it's justice's final breath." Clara looked at Eli then, and in that single glance, the fear that had ruled her heart began to fade, replaced by something steady, hope. The judge's gavel came down one last time, the sound echoing like thunder through the still air. "Clara Dawson," he said, his voice steady yet gentle, "you are free to go." For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom, once filled with doubt and whispers, now stood silent, humbled by truth. Clara's tears fell quietly, each one carrying months of pain, fear, and the fragile hope that justice might still exist. Eli stepped toward her, his boots slow against the wooden floor, and when he reached her, he removed his hat and offered his hand. "You waited long enough," he whispered. She looked at him, her smile trembling, half in disbelief, half in peace, and took his hand without a word. As they stepped into the fading light of Dust Creek, the air felt different, lighter, free, like the world had finally exhaled. Two silhouettes rode away, leaving behind dust, judgment, and the memory of mercy.